This wonderful person right here who is one of the wisest of people on the planet. And he has wonderful books of poetry, but there's a book of prose that I regard as one of the great books of our time. And that is indeed entitled The Practice of the Wild. And here's my pal, Gary Snyder.
Thank you. Well, I'm not entirely in place here, except as somebody from the west of the Rockies of North America. I can count to that. But I've always felt that my own home base territory was the west slope of the west coast, from basically Anchorage, Alaska to Big Sur. And I grew up around Seattle. Hey, I didn't turn on my thing.
Yeah, you're on.
Am I on?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Gosh. So it's a slightly different perspective of place and perspective of economics of place that I bring to it. I traveled a lot outside of the west slope of the west coast over the years, and made it all around through the Aleutian chain and down into Japan and East Asia, and have been back and forth across the Pacific by ship several times, and all over India and into Nepal. But that was all just a way to reaffirm my understanding of where I was from. And also, as in those years, it was possible, and I did it a number of times. I got down into the Southwest here, as well as the Great Basin, and initially had to learn to feel at home when I was in a place where there was very little rain, and in which the big tall conifers were not growing. I've lived now for 45 years in a house that I built in the summer of 1970 at the 3,000-foot level in the Sierra Nevada of Northern California, in the ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, incense cedar, and black oak zone, which is, by any comparison down this way, it's heavy forest. In fact, it is a high level of annual biomass production in the ponderosa pine forest in particular, almost as high an annual biomass as in the Douglas fir forest of the west side. You guys talk ranching, we talk logging, we talk timber. And it's interesting to compare those things. There are plenty of small towns and plenty of small landowners scattered throughout the rural West, which would be I'm going to talk about the timber West right now, from Northern California all the way up to southern Alaska, southeast Alaska. But the heart of it, as the forestry people would say, is in the Doug fir zone. The West Slope Doug fir, that's the way they like to talk about it. And those trees are big, and they are some of the biggest trees in the world. And they put on some of the largest amount of biomass annually in the world, or did, but most of it has already been cut. And there are only some tiny islands of what you call really ancient forest in Oregon, Washington, British Columbia is even worse, actually, and parts of Northern California. So we have ways of thinking about sustainability and community forests, just as the Quivira Coalition has been thinking about sustainability and the various ways that grasslands, ranches can maybe come out with better results. And these are very interesting comparisons, and also difficult to make a close comparison for one very simple reason. If you're a forest landowner, a timberland landowner, and you're not a big company, if you're a big company like Weyerhaeuser, you can have a whole hired bunch of foresters and geneticists and managers working for you and planning ahead for as many decades as you like. And there are big forest landowners like that on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington and on the slopes on the west side coming away from Mount St. Helens. And they're very sophisticated. And if they want to put a greenwash ad into one of the national magazines, they'll do it anytime. And you'll see it every once in a while, a lovely greenwash ad. Just like some of these oil company ads that say, I think big oil should help small towns. You know, and then somebody down below from Chevron or something says, we do too. It's such bullshit. And there are lots of small forest landowners in the Northwest, on the West Slope, and I'm one of them, actually. A mere 100 acres of ponderosa pine. But the thing is, you only get an income once every 40 years. When you can't continually log it, really. And so you have to plot ahead, and you have to do timber maintenance work and forest fire hazard reduction work from year to year as best you can in a certain amount of planting. But the actual income is spotty and is stretched out over lots of time. And so that's why your wife has to be a school teacher or run a kindergarten or something. And that's typical of the rural Pacific Northwest, I'm afraid. Well, down here in the Southwest, my very first friend from about 1967 or 68 was a young poet named Drummond Hadley, who, with his wife and young kids, or two, were living in Tucson, Arizona. And Drummond and I took off for several weeks in the middle of December one year with his big old four-wheel drive truck to explore around down into the Pinacate, camping out in the Pinacate, and parking the truck and checking our direction off with the compass and then walking for miles over toward the Gulf of California. On the edge of the Gulf of California, from the Pinacate, you see a wall of rolling reddish pink sand dunes, some of them 800 or 1,000 feet high for miles. We went right up to the foot of some of them. A beautiful color. And that was, when I figured out what that was, I began to have an idea about the Southwest. You know what they are? Down in the Pinacate, on the edge of the Gulf of California? They're the interior of the Grand Canyon, as having been carried down there and then moved around by the wind. So talk about erosion. Well, the Grand Canyon is a big case of erosion. I'm coming to that because I came to, in trying to understand where I was 35, 40 years ago when I visited down here at first, I read John Wesley Powell. I read about John Wesley Powell, and I was able to get the truth of what he said when he said, the first thing you have to understand about the West, it's an arid zone. And then going a little farther with that, and looking at some, like there's a really great botanical zone map out of Utah about the entire Southwest, divided into 8 or 10 different plant zones, color-coded. And the unfortunate news is, folks, most of the Southwest is not suitable grasslands. most of it will never be suitable for cows. There are some places that are uniquely good, and the mountain meadows are really a treasure. But there are thousands of square miles of sagebrush that is not going to convert over to grasslands in the future, and even less so in the future if you want to worry about global warming. However, if it's any consolation at all, since the end of the last ice age, 11,000 years ago or so, the Southwest has been drying out. And it's been a steady process of drying out. There used to be some beautiful, huge lakes up in Nevada. One of them was called Lake Lahontan, and it included the playa of what is now called the Black Rock Desert, where the Burning Man festival is held. And there are a number of other playas that were once lakes. You can get a map of what the lakes of Nevada were 10,000 years ago, if you want. It's published by the United States government. It's cheap. And the lakes are blue, so you're not in any mistake about what's what. So the first thing about being inspired to adaptation is you better be. Because the world is impermanent, and the biomes, the botanic and other biotic forces are all in change as well, and have been in change for hundreds of millions of years. That is not a thought to encourage or to discourage. It's just one of the facts that we're coming to have more reason to live with maybe now than we had before. During that period also, I started reading, having grown up on John Muir, I started reading Aldo Leopold and other of that generation of ecological writers. And Leopold is really one of the most articulate of the bunch. And the first one to really propose the term, and with some clarity, land ethic. And to begin to talk about what he called the health of the land. And preparing for this event here today, which is much bigger than I thought it was going to be. I didn't realize it was going to be this great big hotel with all you people here. I thought it was going to be a bunch of Albuquerque hippies.
It is.
Oh. Don't say that. I went over and reread the chapter, especially in the Sand County Almanac, on the land ethic. And just to remind ourselves, it's pretty interesting. He was a Forest Service guy. He was affected, no doubt, by some of that very pragmatic Forest Service attitude that is still very much in effect. One of the things I like about Courtney White's book, A Revolution on the Range, is that he isn't too grouchy with the Forest Service. He gives it a little credit now and then. He even says some of them are pretty good guys. But he's also right on when he says it's very hard to talk to them sometimes. And the truth is, of course, the government agencies, BLM, Forest Service, Park Service too, I suppose, they have to tailor whatever they do and whatever they write and say to the annual request for a budget. And so global warming is a good excuse for another budget. And it's being taken that way by some of the agencies who say, okay, now we need some money to study global warming. So there we go, marching onward. But and Jack read some eloquent quotes about the commons. We are very fortunate in the United States in one regard, and that is that we have a very large commons. And that is all of these national forests and all that BLM land is not federal land. The government does not own it. And I'm always trying to correct people on that point. Page 70 of the Revolution, of the Ranch Revolution by Courtney White makes that mistake. Page 70, at the top of the page. It says the public lands are federal lands. And he corrects himself in other places and calls it the federal commons. And how do we know that it is the public land? Because we have the right to go to hearings and to testify and to argue, as I have done many times, about where they want to put the roads and how many board feet of timber they want to take out of that timber sale. And you can do the same thing in the area of grazing leases, arguing pro and con, and of course there's been a lot of that. Or you can do it in some of the national parks and some of the areas where tourism is being developed, and argue about the impact of traffic and tourism if you want to. At any rate, it is the public's right, and I would say responsibility, to get in there and participate in the dialogues that happen everywhere on public land, and not to just stand back and say, "Goddamn Forest Service," or something, which, you know, my neighbors do. I live in a county that's about evenly split between dope-growing anarchists and right-wing Christians. I'm not kidding. Nevada County, California. And somehow they managed to get by from one year to the next, but just barely. So, you know, I've worked with that concept of the commons myself in my book, The Practice of the Wild, and making the point that language is a commons that cannot be and should not be privatized. What the commons really means is not just, like Rena said, she was wrong. It's not everything. It's things that cannot be privatized.
Now.
Anytime. Don't try to say that my beadwork belongs to the commons. See, because I made that beadwork. And I can give it to the commons, but I'll keep it till I want to give it to the commons.
Okay.
Yeah. And so there is that distinction, you know, and your children don't belong to the commons. They belong to the family.
You privatize your kids.
You better. Okay, where was I? So here's a critical quote, a couple of critical quotes from Aldo Leopold. He says, first he's complaining. No important change in ethics was ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphasis, loyalties, affections, and convictions. The proof that conservation has not yet touched these foundations of conduct lies in the fact that philosophy and religion have not yet heard of it. Of our attempts to make conservation easy, we have made it trivial. What is he saying there? He's saying nobody paid attention to his idea of the land ethic. And they didn't, particularly. Why? Because it's too radical. You know, we barely are able to have an ethic in regard to each other. And then the Ten Commandments says nothing about animals. The commandment, thou shalt not kill, applies only to human beings. And so the Occidental world, in both the religious and the scientific side of it, has had a hard time, is still having a hard time, coming to terms with the idea that there are other entities in the world that are not our property and not even our responsibility, that we have some moral obligation toward. That is such a radical thought that it didn't quite occur either to Aldo Leopold. Nonetheless, he bravely marched on and made his statement, which is what everybody has heard, A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. That's his final statement in the last chapter of the last section of the Sand County Almanac. And what does that militate against? He doesn't say it, but it militates against the idea of profit and the idea of using economics as part of your judgment in how you treat the natural world. And that is the difficulty with it, and remains the difficulty with it still. And we will simply have to take that as a productive contradiction that we can creatively live with, because there is no resolution for that exactly. Except, there is one resolution to it in a sense, which is the Native American and hunter-gatherer society resolution to the question of, if there is a precept that says you should not take animal life, what do we do when we want to eat? You say thank you. That's why saying grace is so important at mealtime. And that I have seen in effect with Eskimo people, Yukon Athabascan people in central Alaska, coming down the coast, you find it everywhere. People say, our human life is such that we have to take life, but we must say thank you, and we must feel some gratitude. That's a huge step. But we live in a huge industrial, Euro-American, and also Islamic, Middle Eastern cultural zone that nobody wants to say thank you in yet. Maybe they'll learn that much. That's my little wrap on that. So I'm going to read a few poems now, and I'm going to open with 2 poems by my friend, the poet from Tucson, Drum Hadley, who went on later to be a major ranching figure in the Southwest. And then, because of a severe and tragic automobile accident, had to retire from being active in that movement. But other people are carrying it on. And he is still alive, but he is somewhat in seclusion. Drum's book, which came out over 10 years ago, is called Voice of the Borderlands. He went up to the cowboy poetry gatherings in Elko on a number of occasions, and Jack has been up there too, as usual, interviewing people. But the interesting thing about Hadley as a poet is he never got sucked into the, sucked into it is too harsh, tempted by writing his poems in the traditional ballad meter, which most of the cowboy poets still write in. There's nothing wrong with ballad meter. That or 14ers, as it's called, 14 syllables, 14 syllable long lines with AABB couplets. Now, you guys don't want to know all that, but I'll tell you something. Almost all of the country and western music you hear on the radio is still in ballad meter. And if you go to a Protestant church and you sing hymns, it will be in ballad meter, which is also sometimes known as hymn meter. So there you go. You're still in it. So he wrote a free verse, and one of his poetic mentors was the great poet Charles Olson, who was not in the least interested in ranching or anything like it. So this is one of Drum's poems. Gathering cattle for the Fish Creek Cattle Association before the snows trap them in the high country. A few snowflakes falling, light clean smell of the wind and the sage. It takes these cold nights to make a good day, says Lester Jacobson, Melody Ranch foreman. Melting frost on the wheatgrasses, turning to dewdrops in that first morning light. We had a pretty hard, cold winter last year, Lester says. There's sure going to be lots of new babies coming this fall. Cattle drifting ahead of our horses' hooves, drifting down the trails past Slate Creek, Crystal Creek, brown backs of Herefords, snowy clouds on the mountain peaks, crystal flats to Horsetail along the Gros Ventre River Road. Quick, right across the river, through those falling aspen leaves. Cows and calves slipping away. Steamy mists drifting off the warm springs that we pass. Drifting over the scattered snows. A longhorn bull jumps over the fence onto the highway past Kelly. Starts the bulls to fighting. Scattered cows and calves all over the slick highway. Big semi-trucks waiting to pass. We'll pick 'em up tomorrow. Leave 'em there, says Lester, by that cottonwood tree just past the Mormon Road, where the buck rail fence runs in from the west. When those cold snows get to flying, these old cows come a trailing down from the high country, through these mountain passes. They've done it before. They've learned the way. Yep, says Lester. They come a-trailing down here, one following the other, just as smooth as a schoolmarm's leg. I got to mess that line up. Just as smooth as a schoolmarm's leg. Drum, when he was a young man, worked on ranches in Mexico as a laborer, cowboy, all around Buckaroo, and says, boy, that's where they really know cowboying. That's where they really know braiding. That's where they really know how to dress. That's where they know how to sing. He says, the farther you get north of the border, the more washed out the cowboy culture becomes. Interesting. He also was a guy with lots of money, as it turned out. Although when he was a young guy, he didn't really know that, and he didn't pay attention to it even. It wasn't clear to him, what was involved. But later he was able to write this poem from toward the very end of his book, which is really a treasure if you can get a copy of it, called Our Lands in the Belly of the Beast. Businessmen overheard in the Palm Court restaurant, Plaza Hotel, New York City, America. Take them, invite them out to lunch. Don't get attached. It's money, it's property, it's real estate, it's things, you say. Do you want to sell? What do you want to pay me to sell it to you for? We made 50 or 60 million. He died penniless. His children asked us for $1,000 for the funeral. It was tax deductible. Of course, we gave it to them. Is it legal? The government pays lip service. The property will be worth more than 8 to 10 times what we pay for it. You will ask them for 3 or 4. But before they know it, you will get 10 million. When I am going to foreclose, I pay the lawyers maybe 50,000, 4%, 3%, 5%. The poor man never wants to pay the lawyers. So the poor man will lose. These companies are like candy stores. Make all the dough you can. Buy today, sell them short. Take them, invite them out to lunch. Subdivisions in mountain valleys, wild running rivers, country ways of livelihood, deer, cowboys, mountain lions, javelinas. Don't get attached. It's money, it's property, it's real estate, it's things. Take them, invite them out to lunch.
Well done. Harold.
Seyo kijin shu sitsuryo toku homan om makara sai soaka. We offer it to all demons and spirits. May all be filled and satisfied. Om makula sai swaha. Su Dongpo, the great Chinese governor of South China, poet, and Zen adept of the 12th century AD, Su Dongpo, sat out one whole night by a creek on the slopes of Mount Lu. Next morning, he showed this little poem to his teacher. The stream with its sounds is a long, broad tongue. The looming mountain is a wide-awake body. Throughout the night, song after song, how can I speak at dawn? Old Master Zhang Tsung approved him. 2 centuries later, speaking of this poem, the Japanese priest Dogen said, "Sounds of streams and shapes of mountains. The sounds never stop. The shapes never cease. Was it Su who became enlightened, or was it the mountains and streams? Billions of beings see the morning star. They all become Buddhas. If you, monks, who are valley streams and looming mountains, can't throw some light on the nature of ridges and rivers, who the hell can?" That's all a true story. Footnote aside, you've been up to the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe. You remember the little page that describes the 18th century list of old New Mexican genetics? It's a way to help us all understand the world. The Palace of the Governors, 18th century listing of genetic possibilities. Espanol, white, but maybe a mestizo, or anyone who has enough money and the right style. Indio, a Native American person. Mestizo, one Spanish and one Indio parent. Color quebrado, broken color, a rare category of three-way or more mix, like white African Indio. Mulatto, white African ancestry. Coyote, Indio parent with a mestizo parent. Lobo, one Indio plus one African parent. Genizaro, Plains Indian captives used as slaves. I hope they can use something like that in the next census when it goes around. A few new poems. Gnarly, for my late wife, Carol. Gnarly, G-N-A-R-L-Y, you know, like teenagers say. Splitting 8-inch long rounds from a beetle kill pine tree we felled so it wouldn't later smash a shed, with a borrowed splitter, Briggs and Stratton, 20-ton pressure wedge on a piston push rod. Some rounds fall clean down, split in two. Some tough and thready, knotty, full of frass and galleries, gnarly, gnarly. My woman, gnarly. She was sweet. Hey, folks, you don't have to clap after every poem, even if you want to. Wait till the end or something. Anger, cattle, and Achilles. The anger of Achilles, the wrath of Achilles, is, in a sense, the key to the Iliad, is the key story in the Iliad. Achilles was the great warrior hero who could just about kill everybody else and was, apparently invulnerable. At the battle on the fields in front of the walls of Troy, with the Greek ships beached up on the beach behind him. Achilles was in his tent, and he had his sweetheart there, an 18-year-old girl named Briseis. Agamemnon, the chief, the leader, the boss of the whole army, took her away from him and said, I want her. There was nothing Achilles could do about that, I guess, but he was so angry that he stayed in his tent for 6 weeks and did not go out to battle on the fields, and many Greeks were killed. And that was part of the famous wrath of Achilles. But this poem only barely touches on that. Still, you got to know these things. Like if somebody asks you, what was the name of the girlfriend of Achilles? Remember that? Briseis. I wonder whatever happened to her in the end. 2 of my best friends quit speaking. One said his wrath was like that of Achilles. The 3 of us had traveled on the desert, awakened to birdsong and sunshine under ironwoods in a wadi south of the border. They both were herders, one with cattle and poems, the other with business and tools, and books. Books. The other with business and books. One almost died in a car crash, but slowly recovered. The other gave up all his friends and took refuge in a city and studied the nuances of power. One of them I haven't seen in years. I met the other lately in the far back of a bar, musicians playing near the window, and he sweetly told me, listen to that music. The self we hold so dear will soon be gone. We thought a lot about wildfire this summer. I bet you all did. It was so overwhelmingly terrible and sad to hear about those 19 young men that died in the Yarnell fire, all killed in one group. And then we had, a little later in the year, the largest fire we've ever had in the Sierra Nevada, the Rim Fire, that burned up one of the northwest corners of Yosemite and well into the Stanislaus National Forest. And it was a hot fire. I haven't been back into it, but I've seen photographs from it. Everything is toast in there. And the debate is going on right now. Salvage logging or leave it alone. And there are arguments. There are arguments for both sides. Strictly speaking, technically speaking, properly speaking, the national park should do nothing. This is their chance to see what happens if you don't fight fire in a really hot fire. But the Forest Service, is not allowed to not do nothing, partly because they're going to get a budget for it. So that drove me to think about the history of wildfire over the last 100 million years.
Gee.
Well, you got to go back a little bit. We know, we all know, indigenous people, Native Americans, set fires all the time. We certainly know they did it in California as regularly. Every summer, they would be setting fires. But the Forest Service, has quite a forest fire research corps that's working on questions about this. One of the things that they came up with is the fact that roughly 20,000 lightning strikes hit the Sierra Nevada every summer. And lightning strikes are all over the country in various parts of the mountains and other landscapes every year, and always have been. Another interesting fact, 40 or 50 million years ago, there was more oxygen in the atmosphere. And just enough oxygen, they say, to make fires burn even hotter than they burn now. Another interesting fact, the Sequoia gigantea, when they get really big, has bark that is sometimes 2 feet thick. And the bark is not flammable. It will not burn. One more point. There are several species of pine that we call fire pines that are fire adapted. And like the gray pine in the foothills of California. After a fire goes over and the cones fall off the trees, the cones open from the heat and they pop the seeds out, and the preparations are laid for the pine regenerating itself. Those are called fire pines. Now, you know, it must have taken a few million years to adapt so that those things would happen for the Sequoia gigantea or for the pines. So I came up, tentatively with this poem, Wildfire News. The millions, the hundreds of millions of years, there were fires. Fire after fire. Fire raging forest or jungle. Giant lizards racing away. Big necks coming up out of the sea, looking at the land in surprise. Fire after fire. Lightning strikes by the thousands, just like today. Volcanoes erupting, fire flowing over the land. Giant sequoia, 2-foot thick fireproof bark. Fire pines, their cones love the heat. How long to say? That's how they covered the continents. 10 lakhs of millennia or more. I have to slow down my mind. Slow down my mind. Rome was built in a day.
Very good.
Lakh is a Sanskrit word, L-A-K-H, that is in the dictionary, but only because the British put it in. And it means 10,000. It's a common counting, a common number to use in counting in Hindi and in Sanskrit, and maybe in London, but not here. I'm coming toward the end here, folks. This is called Stories in the Night. Where I live, I've lived in the same house now since 1970. We built it there as a kind of a communal hippie project without much clothes on in the summer of 1970. It was fun. And we had no electricity and no power tools. And we even fell all of the pine trees that were used in the total framework of it is all in pine, rounds. We fell them with 2-person saws, barked them with big draw knives. We did that the summer before, and then put them up on sawhorses to dry out over the winter. And we had all of the other supplies on hand on the day that we got everybody to promise to join in, and we built it with about 12 people camping out for 3 months. It was a great exercise. I've improved it a little bit since then, not much. But one of the improvements was solar panels and a generator, a backup generator. But for 45 years, I've never been on the grid. And so and that's true of about 30 of my neighbors too. So, you learn how to be very careful and thoughtful about how you use electricity through all of that. And so this poem opens up with some generator problems, but goes and that kind of thing. But then it goes on to deep issues of ethics and philosophy. But the key to it all is the quote at the very beginning. In native California, the winter was the only storytelling time throughout all of native California. No stories in the summer. You are all scattered out all over the landscape doing things. Yesterday, I was working most of the day with a breakdown in the system. Generator 1, generator 2, old phased out generator 3, the battery array, the big trace inverter, the solar panels, all stopped. Cold, early morning in the dark. Back to the old days, kerosene lamps, candles, wood stoves always work. The backup generator, number 3 Honda, cycles wrong, tricking the inverter relay that starts the bulk charge. I try to remember, machinery can always be fixed. But be ready to give up the plans that were made for that day. Go back to the manual, call up friends who know more, make some tea, relax with your tools and your problems, start enjoying the day. First 15 years we lived here, kerosene lamps, heavy tile roof in the shade of a huge pre-contact black oak. Sherry, Siegfried's long-term woman friend and partner, is due at any time with a 9-ton truck of 3/4-inch crushed rock. Wet dirt every winter eats up gravel. Keeping a few hard roads for drenching winter rains and melting snows takes planning. You have to ditch them too. In 1962, going all through Kyushu with Joanne, walked around the town of Nagasaki. Busy streets, coffee shops, green leafy trees and gardens, a lively place. But at Mount Aso, the great caldera in the center of the island, the crater 15 miles across, saw sightseers from Nagasaki with the twisted, shiny, scarred, burned faces of survivors from those days. And then read an English language translation of Barefoot Gen, a graphic novel about living through an atomic bomb. You may still be able to find it around. What got to me about the bomb was too much power. And then the temptation there to become the first to be the emperor of the world, yet to be done. So change our course around, or there we head. I could never be a Muslim, a Christian, or a Jew, because the 10 Commandments fall short of moral rigor. The Bible, shalt not kill, leaves out the other realms of life. How could that be? What sort of world did they think this was? With no account for all the wriggling feelers and the little fins, the spines, the slimy necks, eyes shiny in the night, paw prints in the snow. And that other thing, can't have no other God before me. Profound anxiety of power and jealousy and envy? What sort of God is that? Worrying all the time. Plenty of little gods are waiting to begin their practice and learn just who they are. In North India, 4th century AD, some tantric Buddhist teacher lady said, "That God called Yahweh to the West, he's really something. But too bad, he has this nutty thing that he is the creator of the world." A delusion that could really set you back. But returning to energy, I'll fix the Onan, give up on number 3, it's too far gone, And next time, get a backup with a cast iron block and water cooling and a warranty good for centuries. Put in a bunch more panels for the sun. The old-time people here in warm earth lodges 30 feet across burned pitchy pine wood slivers for their candles. Snow after snow for all those centuries before. Lodge fire light and pitchy slivers burning. Don't need much light for stories in the night.
Beautiful day.
What time have I got? I got 2 more. 2 short ones. I want to inspire you now. And 2 different angles of inspiration. If this one doesn't work, the next one will. What food? This is if things really get hard around here. You know, like worrying about running out of water. Well, what about if you really did run out of water? Then what would you do? Okay, well, this is Quivira Apache. And it's called What Food We Lived On Then. Harry Hoyer got this from a Quivira Apache gentleman about 50 years ago. He says, "Oh, Mr. Hoyer, now I'll tell also what food we lived on then. Mescal, yucca fruit, pinon, acorns, prickly pear, sumac berry, cactus, spurge, drop seed, lip fern, corn, mountain plants, wild potatoes, mesquite, stems of yucca, tree flowers, tree yucca flowers, choke cherries, pitahaya cactus, honey of the ground bee, honey of the bumblebee, mulberries, anglepod, berries, berries of the one-seeded juniper, wild cattle, mule deer, antelopes, white-tailed deer, wild turkeys, doves, quail, squirrels, robins, slate-colored juncos, song sparrows, wood rats, prairie dogs, rabbits, peccaries, burros, mules, horses, buffaloes, mountain sheep, and turtles." No need to worry. A letter to M.A. who lives far away. She was 13 and she up in British Columbia, and she I knew her dad and her mother. They were practicing Zen part of the time with us, sitting, meditating. I was up there in BC in the Straits of Georgia and ran onto them up there, and she knew I wrote poetry, so she said, "Can I write you a letter?" And I said, "Sure." And then she wrote me a letter all in rhyme from British Columbia. This is 30 years ago. And I wrote her back, and this is what I wrote her back. A letter to M.A. who lives far away. "Dear Melissa, I do remember you. You had curly hair and stood there by the stair up there on Quadra Isle with a shy smile. Say hello to your mother Jean. I don't remember your sister's name, and that's a shame, but I sort of remember her face and natural grace. Not all poetry has to rhyme, but this time I'm writing back the way you did it. It's to your credit. You got me to write this form since real poetry is born from a formless place, which is our original face, Buddhist teachers say, in play. So if this helps you be a writer, it will please your new friend, Gary Snyder."
Beautiful, Gary.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's it.
I think that's all, folks. Thank you so much.